Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sara Pantuliano. I'm the Chief Executive at ODI. Today, I have the great pleasure of introducing a panel of colleagues who are engaged and committed to elevating the profile and presence of local actors in global development decision-making and to increase their access to resources. The title of our seminar is Localizing Aid. Why aren't we there yet? I must admit, I'm not a strong fan of the term localization. I've said it many times. I think it implies a transitive action. It implies that the global north can localize something that is inherently local. But let's use it as a shorthand for the purpose of this conversation. The localization agenda is intimately tied to the evolution of power, to those who have traditionally not had access to such influence. That's something we are strongly committed to here at ODI. Our commitment to shifting power is among my highest priorities. We want those who have a more intimate lived experience of the realities of global challenges to be the driving force behind our research. And that encompasses all kinds of global challenges, whether they're facing down patriarchal norms, whether they're dealing with conflict and displacement, adapting to drought and flood conditions, grappling with rising prices, unemployment uncertainty. It is those who are closer to these challenges that we want to really be guiding who we write and talk about. Our 5-year strategy is committing us to transforming the ways in which ODI produces knowledge and shares knowledge. We want to make sure that our work is produced through collaborative partnerships throughout our global network. So our goal is really to be driven and oriented by the energy and ideas of those who are closest to these wicked problems that I was mentioning before. But of course, as you can all imagine, a change of this scale and magnitude can be resisted. Can be resisted openly or can be resisted indirectly. And it's proving really challenging to shift power when it comes to resources, to agency, to knowledge, even for the most committed organizations or well-intentioned leaders. So this seminar is squarely focused on discussing some of these bottlenecks, some of these sources of resistance from the perspective of funding institutions that are seeking to localize. They are coming up with creative solutions, how to remove these bottlenecks, how to at least mitigate against them. So I'm especially excited that we're going to have a discussion across different types of funders. We'll be delving into what northern donors and philanthropic actors may be able to learn from each other in their own localization journeys. Let me take a moment to introduce our brilliant panelists that we have joining us, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Nilima Gurrajani. Nilima is a senior research fellow in our development and public finance team at ODI. She will set the scene for the seminar discussion and moderate the event. But let me introduce our colleagues. So we are joined by Julia Rao. Julia is the manager of global internships and career placement at the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. She is particularly the author of a study of Canadian engagement with localization called Localization of International Assistance, Canadian International Development Organizations, Perspectives, Practices, Successes, and Challenges. Along with Julia, we have Rosie Pinnington. Rosie is a research associate at King's College London in the Department of Political Economy, but she's also the lead author of the ODI report, Why Aren't We There Yet? Understanding and Addressing Donor Barriers to Localization and Climate Adaptation. Joining us also is Peter Lohern. Peter is the CEO of the Coran Hilton Foundation. He has a very long and distinguished career working internationally for nonprofit and foundations. I'm not going to summarize because we'll be here for a very long time. But the main reason he's with us today is because he has played a key role with the Hilton Foundation. Under his leadership, has really been working hard to move the dial to turn the discussion on localization from theory to practice. Also with us is Moses Esoba. Moses is the executive director of the Uganda National NGO Forum. That is a civil society platform for governance and democracy influencing in Uganda. But Moses is also a member of the Reimagining INGOs, or RINGO Social Lab. It's a group of practitioners that are aiming to reimagine INGOs through disruption, innovation, and systemic thinking. And last but not least, we're joined by Orla Kelly. Orla is a development specialist with the Development Cooperation Division at the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, also known as Irish Aid, and she co-leads Irish Aid's policy engagement on locally led development. with a fantastic group of colleagues for our discussion today. Without further ado, over to you, Nilima.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I'd like to start with just a few housekeeping rules. We have a great turnout, great audience, and a fantastic set of panelists, but we only have an hour, so we need to try and keep our comments brief, and we want to have time for Q&A. I especially want to thank those who have joined us very early in the morning or very late in the day. I think the response that we've had is that this is kind of an international audience, and so really appreciate you joining us. In terms of housekeeping, this webinar is part of a larger effort at ODI to bring evidence to bear on conversations with actors across the sector, across the official sector, the philanthropic sector, the activist civil society sector, and the research sector, to really debate key institutional and organizational evolutions in a very different world of aid giving. In the chat, you'll see a link to the work that we're doing under the brand Donors in a Post-Aid World with a newsletter. Do sign up to stay on top of our events and our latest research. Also, just a second point on housekeeping terminology. I will be using the term Global South to refer to global majority countries, not to elide differences between them, but because that is a term that is often used and rolls off my tongue certainly a little bit more easily than global majority countries. When I speak of donors, I am talking about northern-based official funders of development. We're making a deliberate attempt to focus on the northern ecosystem here, and when referring to philanthropy, I will make a direct reference to philanthropy. And lastly, just for questions, we really welcome questions in the Q&A box. Please type them there, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. If we can't, feel free to drop me a line on an email, and I'll try and kind of muster an answer for you at a later date. So just to quickly set the scene, why do I think a conversation on donor barriers to localization is really important at this particular juncture? I guess I have 3 points to make here. The first is there are more and more formal commitments to localization that are being made. The COVID crisis sort of initially kind of was the prompt for experiments in localization, let's say, and aligned with the Black Lives Matters movement, really for addressing kind of racism and power imbalances in the sector itself. Procedures that seemed impossible to modify were modified in an instant. Vast quantities of funds were rapidly redirected. And that you can contrast to some of the kind of more limited success of the Grand Bargain agreement to localize finance. The idea that we needed to make localized funding, as local as possible and as international as only necessary. The goal of achieving 25% of humanitarian funding to local and national responders by 2020 has proven a challenge. In 2022, only 1.2% of overall assistance was delivered to those local actors. We do have a donor statement on supporting locally led development, signed at the GPDC meeting in December 2022, with 15 foundations joining subsequently, including the Conrad Hilton Foundation in 2023, with commitments to shift and share power, to channel high quality funding as directly and as local as possible, and really for those donors to publicly advocate for locally led development by sharing platforms such as this one, for example. So I think there are these formal commitments now in place that really suggest the need for a conversation in terms of how they're going to be delivered on. The second point is that there are risks that these commitments and the expectations on the donor community are too great and exceed their capacity to actually deliver. I think the reality of the implementation challenge is starting to bite. Localization is hard for all sorts of reasons, as we'll get into in this session. I think the fact that the OECD is conducting a peer review at the minute to really learn from DAC members' policies and mechanisms, systems, and practices for enabling locally led development is very promising. I think there is no doubt an effort in the localization space to focus on managerial practice, funder policy, reporting requirements, risk tolerance, little less so on tackling some of the structural issues like racism and power imbalances of the donor-recipient logic. And so, localization is not as existential a threat, perhaps, as decolonization, with the latter raising much more fundamental questions about power. But even so, it's still hard, even with that instrumental rationale, that you will be able to get more bang for your spending. It is very difficult. But localization then becomes an important demonstration of donors' good faith. But it also risks leaving them exposed as it sits against other political and policy goals and institutional rules. And taken to its logical conclusion, an expansive understanding of localization can really feel threatening to organizational longevity, credibility, and survival. The last quick one I wanted to say is we want to encourage lesson learning, and this is also why this is a very timely seminar, because there is a real risk that localization just becomes the next fad in the way participatory development arguably became a fad. So I think, learning from others across silos, from the INGO and the philanthropic community that are perhaps further advanced ahead of the curve, learning from what Southern actors can tell us and Southern civil society activists. There's a lot of initiative and a lot of enthusiasm. The Shifting the Power of the Summit in December was enthusiasm in those sectors. I think we see much more mixed sectors in the official donor community. So with that, I'd like to really congratulate our panelists for really joining us in what we hope will be an open and honest conversation that really gets us into some of the discussion, these barriers, and some of the learnings that come from there. So we have two presentations that are really research-based presentations that are focused on survey data, on qualitative in interviews that are helping us understand these barriers and what can be done to surmount them. And with that, I will start with Rosie, perhaps, who is today launching a new paper from ODI, which will also be in the link in the chat. Thanks so much. Rosie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nalima. Nalima's given an excellent context for this study. So I'm going to start with where we started. Despite widespread enthusiasm, as Nalima has outlined, progress has been slow and significant barriers remain. In our paper, we examine the barriers that bilateral donors face in their efforts to promote locally led practices in climate adaptation, where specific commitments have been made to meet the principles for locally led adaptation. We examine climate adaptation initiatives in Uganda, drawing on interviews with 3 bilateral donors, the US, the UK, and Sweden, as well as their intermediary partners and Ugandan stakeholders, government, civil society, and academia. And I should say at this point that when I refer to a local actor, I am encompassing all of those different actors, right from national level government to civil society to academia. So we don't have a narrow definition of local actor here, and it's certainly not just subnational actors either. So in our study, we found 5 central barriers affecting donor localization efforts. The first is risk aversion. There is a perception that working more directly with local actors can pose additional risks. In Uganda, public sector corruption has contributed to an environment of limited donor trust, which has reduced opportunities to implement adaptation initiatives via government financial and delivery systems. The second barrier we identify are those connected to administrative challenges. So locally led approaches can often be more resource and staff intensive, especially when working with organizations that are unfamiliar with donor systems and requirements. There are also, we also found that donors are still developing their own skills and capacities related to locally led adaptation. And these include soft skills involved in processes like co-creation and facilitation. The third barrier that we identify is dual accountabilities. Donors face split constituencies where they are accountable to actors in both donor domestic and local contexts. We found, as a number of studies have also found, that donor accountability is often skewed towards its own domestic constituents. And in Uganda specifically, this has affected the continuity and predictability of funding for local actors, including government and civil society. So fourth, we identify divergent values. The values that donors pursue in their development cooperation, including gender equality, the promotion of democracy or liberal economics, can come into tension with local norms and practices. And donors can often be pursuing active, change in those local norms as well. In Uganda, we identified this in the challenges connected to LGBTQ+ rights in particular, which have been framed as a Western imposition in political discourse. Finally, the fundamental barrier we identify is power asymmetries. We find that the unequal power dynamic between local actors and donors is the fundamental constraint at the center of localization efforts. And this manifests in how and the extent to which local knowledge and capability is valued. So to overcome these barriers and ensure that localization commitments can be realized in global adaptation efforts, we offer 5 general recommendations for donors, local and international partners, as well as climate advocates. The first is to strengthen donor capacities and shift mindsets. So local capacity is often highlighted as a challenge to donor localization efforts, but our research showed that donors have capacity strengthening needs as well. These exist at both the organizational level, including the need for new approaches to managing risk and due diligence, as well as at the individual level. So this comes back to the soft skills that we mentioned around shifting mindsets to becoming more humble, flexible, and moving towards more self-reflective practice as well. Our second recommendation is on enhancing the access to quality finance, for instance, through streamlining and simplifying funding requirements. So we found that donors are thinking a lot about how they can kind of increase their ability to fund organizations that may not be able to meet their requirements, but are not necessarily reflecting on their own need to streamline and change some of these requirements. And then we also looked at, under this recommendation, exploring options to fund local actors as local intermediaries as well. Third, create more space for local agency and decision-making. So this is really about ensuring that leadership and shifting power is at the center of localization efforts. And we highlight that this can happen even when working with international intermediary partners as well. So fourth, we identify the need to track localization progress in climate goals and instruments. And finally, to reconceptualize how local actor capacity is defined, moving beyond a narrow focus on the ability to manage donor grants and considering and valuing all of the kind of plethora of other local capabilities that exist in terms of contextual knowledge, relationships, accountability to constituents, but also thinking about the broader society beyond even the specific development program or climate adaptation initiative. That's over to you, Nalima.
Thanks, Rosie. And I'll pass it on to Julia to talk about her study.
Thanks, Nalima, and thank you, Rosie. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling in from. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to talk to you about the study I conducted in 2022 on Canadian International Development Organizations' perspectives and practices on localization. So the perspective today that I'm sharing is on Canadian international development sector's feedback on localization. I'm going to call them INGOs moving forward and kind of lumping them with the broader conversation around INGOs, keeping in mind that often INGOs are intermediaries and considered sometimes an impediment towards localization. I won't be focusing in on that today, but I will be sharing their perspectives on donor barriers. So the study looked at 5 dimensions of localization, and today I'll be focusing on the funding dimension, which unsurprisingly was considered one of the most challenging dimension of localization and the least operational. And this is obviously significant, as that one of the key commitments to the Grand Bargain is to increase direct funding to local actors. So this brings us back to the donor barriers, because of what I learned, these funding challenges are coming down from the top down in many intersecting ways. And the 2 most frequently emphasized were the donor compliance measures underpinned by racial and ethnocentric biases, as well as project-based funding modalities that often arise from these compliance measures. I won't dig too deep into the barriers, I think we know a lot about them, but donor compliance measures create restrictive funding modalities and impede direct funding, access to unrestricted funding, and it impacts the quality of funding by limiting core costs, as well as the ease to which funds can be utilized and pivoted when needed, which, when we're thinking of fragile states in emergency situations, when we're thinking of COVID, is really critical. The other frequently cited challenge was the project-based funding model, which is mostly linked to short-term grants and rigid funding modalities. And for anyone who works in the international assistance sector, they'll know that these project-based fundings can change based on government policy, based on changing government parties, as well as shifting geopolitical allegiances and environments. It was cited frequently that projects are becoming larger in scale and more short-term, which benefits donors because they'll have a greater ease of financial oversight and project management, but have at the same time having funds exclusively time-bound for thematically specific projects limits innovation, limits the ability to work with diverse local actors, and crucially stifles small grassroots organizations who do not have the size of staff or the capabilities to bring on staff for short periods of time. So with these key barriers in mind, many INGOs highlighted that their strength in the sector was actually with their partnerships with local actors. And because localization is a long game, and a lot of these international NGOs will be key stepping stones to creating enabling environments and the soft infrastructure needed, I want to focus in on some of the key elements that they bring to the table to support alleviating some of the donor barriers that impede localization. And I also want to mention that the relationship between INGOs and donors goes both ways, and both will need to provide necessary pressure to push the localization agenda forward. In the study, 3 roles that INGOs showcased as part of their unique value in contributing to localization efforts. The first was that they play an intermediary role that can also advocate for improved localization. In Canada, we see this as the pushback from the sector on structural barriers embedded in Canadian tax laws, and pushback against project-based development models that limit the scope and breadth of the localization agenda. A good example is that the sector has actually had really effective efforts to challenge the Income Tax Act and Direction and Control, which is a which is a tax-related function, has been shifted because of the sector's pushback. They also can be fundraisers and campaigners. There was an emphasis on the need to increase funding, especially long-term and flexible funding, and they saw themselves as potential fundraisers for their partners in the Global South. And 50% of the participants said that they encourage and facilitate direct contact between partners and donors. And the last one is that they can support enabling environments for locally led development to become the norm. From the participants' perspective, this can mean many things. That could be standing in solidarity with and advocating for local actors on critical issues on an international platform, sharing relevant knowledge and capacity building efforts in a complementary manner, and lastly, ensuring that their local partners have greater voice within the sector to influence policy and decisions. So this study revealed a wealth of practical learning from participants on localization. Many participants spoke of years of forging solidarity and long-term relationships with partners. So they come with a lot of experience. That said, relying on the goodwill of engaged INGOs is not sufficient. And of course, greater resources, leadership, and official guidance on localization has to come from the donors and government agencies themselves to push forward this agenda and facilitate localization, keeping in mind that they're working with a collaborative, highly knowledgeable, and engaged sector. So I said a lot in a short amount of time, and I look forward to engaging in the Q&A.
Thanks, Julia. We'll now move on to our discussants. And I say discussants very loosely because, we're not expecting you to know those papers intimately, but if you have any quick reactions to what's been said so far, but, also, I have sort of a particular question to steer you as well. So I'll start with Orla from Irish Aid. Orla, what stumbling blocks has Irish Aid faced in its efforts to localize, and how have those barriers been meaningfully overcome? And if not, have they been tolerated? Do we need to just tolerate them? So I'll pass it over to you, Orla.
Thanks so much, Nalima. Just to start by caveating this a small bit with the fact that we're still very much on our localization journey in Irish Aid and still figuring out the roadblocks and the barriers that we need to overcome. We actually recently participated in the OECD DAC peer learning exercise that you mentioned earlier. So a team came over and did lots of interviews and really helped us to unpack a lot of the assumptions that we had internally about our barriers, risk, for example, etc. So that was just a really good exercise that has informed a lot of what I'm about to say now. So just firstly, I would say that I wanted to flag that we do not in Irish Aid have a barrier in terms of political will, thankfully. Internally, our ministers, director general, senior management, etc., are very much behind locally led development as one of our core values. And in Ireland, we're quite lucky to have a very strong domestic political support for our aid programme in general. However, in saying that, I think I really identified with some of Julia's research actually on the finding around diverse interpretations. So looking at locally led development for Irish Aid, it's very much part of our ethos. Our main policy objective is around putting the furthest behind first. And we've always really aimed to implement this through working at a community level, putting people at the center of what we do, taking a very principled and partnership approach. But in saying that, because it's seen as part of our ethos, it can also be taken for granted. So there can be some lack of clarity in our organization about the localization agenda and what it means for us. Some colleagues may feel that it's kind of, it's our bread and butter, we're already doing it, and therefore nothing needs to change. Obviously, that's not the case, and we definitely have work to do. So I think the first roadblock that I wanted to highlight is really internally getting people to agree on a consistent approach, and just to flag that if we don't do that, we risk having all of this commitment, but without the action. The second barrier that I wanted to flag is both an opportunity and a challenge. So Irish Aid is quite good in terms of being a flexible donor. So, we provide a lot of flexible quality multi-year funding, which is obviously an important enabler of locally led development. So obviously, just a couple of examples in terms of our humanitarian work, at least 80% of our humanitarian funding is flexible. We fund the START network, a lot of country-based pool funds which prioritize local partners. Also at HQ level, we have an INGO fund that provides multi-year flexible funding across both development and humanitarian work. And a significant percentage of that is on-granted to local organizations. However, in saying that, this flexibility can actually be a bit of a double-edged sword especially in terms of that on-granting to local organizations. So on the one hand, you have intermediary NGOs and multilateral organizations who are fully permitted by Irish Aid to kind of pass on that same flexibility to their local partners, including, just let me say that, the indirect costs or core costs. But on the other hand, because we haven't really been prescriptive, there has been a mixed approach, I would say, and maybe a bit of confusion and ambiguity in terms of our own, what we want from our partners. And so we're trying to address that internally at the moment through working with INGO partners, in particular through this HQ fund, so that they develop their own approach to locally led development. And so that includes kind of benchmarks for quality funding that is on-granted to local partners. The third stumbling block that I really want to highlight is actually our size. So Irish Aid, obviously, we have big ambitions as a donor, but we are quite small. I would say our embassies are our main channel to provide direct funding to local actors, and around a third of our bilateral spend in country goes to local actors. However, our embassies are again quite small and our footprint is small. We often don't have a physical presence in many of the countries where we deliver aid. When preparing for the DAC peer learning exercise, I remember a colleague saying that if we wanted to do more on localization, we'd need more staff and less money. And, I know that this is a bit of it's a perception around direct funding to local partners requiring increased burden on staff or increased administrative, time of staff, etc., that, increased grant management. And I know that that's something that we need to get around, but that is definitely something that's a barrier for us at the moment, I think, and something that we need to think a bit more creatively about. I also just wanted to flag that as a small donor, obviously we work closely with multilateral partners, and we do lean on the multilateral system as a way to enhance our impact. We also try and influence multilateral partners on doing more to localize, but it's quite hard to track whether that influencing is actually, it's actually doing anything. Lastly, I just wanted to flag risk, because obviously we can't have this conversation without mentioning risk. And it was quite interesting for us in the DAC peer learning exercise, because we really unpacked the assumption around risk being a main barrier for us. And actually, we discovered that it kind of isn't. So, we obviously have compliance measures, counter fraud policies, but we try not to make those overly burdensome. We also try not to let risk get in the way of implementing our policy objectives, for example, around furthest behind first. So I just wanted to flag that, and this has probably happened to us internally, that this, perception around risk aversion can be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy at times, where we just assume that, the risk is too high and therefore we can't do it. But actually it may not be the case. And especially on a case-by-case basis, there's often arguments to be made to waive certain compliance measures, etc. There was a recent example in Sudan where we support emergency rooms through an intermediary partner, and that's something, support to local partners where they can't meet all those compliance measurements, but we do it anyway. So I'll finish there. I'm sorry, I'm kind of speeding through, just to say we're doing a bit, but there is quite a lot to do, I would say, still. Thank you.
Thanks, Orla, for that honest and open reflection. I'll turn to Peter now. So Peter, you're leading a very large foundation, and it'd be really interesting to hear about whether those bottlenecks that Orla mentioned dovetail with any of the ones that you've faced or not. So where are there lessons the official sector can learn from? And are the challenges just fundamentally different? I did note that you have signed a memorandum of understanding with USAID recently, so also maybe talking a bit about what the objective is in partnering with the official sector in that way. Is it lesson learning, or is it something else? Over to you.
Sure, thank you. Great to be here, and I'm really thrilled that there's so much interest in this topic. And I would like to say a little bit about the philanthropic experience of it, but also really salute what the bilaterals have set out to do. Even though the road is long, I think it's something we should all support. Our experience of locally led development, I think, has been a positive one, and there's a lot of momentum, I would say. It aligns with our set of values. And also, when we looked at after the murder of George Floyd, when we said, what is our commitment globally to DEI, it was pretty much a no-brainer to say we should really put our shoulders to locally led development. We have been a foundation that for decades has said about half of our funding should be spent globally, half in the United States. But historically, we did that primarily through big blue chip US nonprofits, World Vision, CARE, Save the Children. And they did extremely good work. But I think it was mostly familiarity, a little bit of tax compliance, and just what we knew how to do. So when the World Humanitarian Summit said 25%, our ears perked up. When Samantha Power said, we're going to go in as well, we said, hey, we should really get involved in this. And we started a whole of org effort to get beyond a 25% goal. How do we source and know who is out there? How do we make proposals simple? How do we do the due diligence in ways that are not overpowering, overwhelming for either the grantee or for our own staff? How do we deal with compliance and risk issues and legal issues? So we had, and how can we get the board actually to very full-throated support of this? And I think it worked quite well. Now there is risk, and there will be mistakes. But we know that if we grant money through international NGOs, 10 or 15% or more will evaporate entirely legitimately in going through their processes to get close to a community or a local setting. So we're willing to take some risk in that regard. It has been, I think, largely successful. We met the 25% target in 2022, just barely, I'll say. And 10 years ago, we were probably at 10% typically. And then this year, we more considerably surpassed it. And also for the moment, hearkening to a comment you made, Nilima, I think at the beginning, we are alarmingly, we are the largest funder in the world of refugee-led organizations. That's a baton we want to pass back to the multilaterals, and to bilaterals here. But come on in, the water is warm, and there's lots that could be done there. I would emphasize this is not just about community-based organizations, even not just civil society organizations. We're also including municipalities in the portfolio, and I think that's a really important and significant addition. I would say, just like most of the bilaterals here, and certainly I think most of the civil society organizations listening, there are kind of two levels you think about this. One is a financial accountability level. I think of that as locally led development 1.0. Are you getting a robust share of your funding to local organizations? But I think the harder thing, and I would disagree with the speaker who said the financial is the hardest thing is co-creating, sharing strategy development. And that for us is locally led development 2.0. We're still on that road. And if strategic philanthropy is very attached to its goal setting. So sharing goal setting, I think, is going to be the real challenge for us, but I think we will do it robustly. You asked about the collaboration with USAID. Well, first of all, I would love to salute that donor statement. I'll put it in the chat later on. It is poetic, it's lyrical. It could have been written by a civil society organization or a foundation. It was written by bilaterals. Hats off to USAID and NORAD for that, but to all 19 governments that have signed that. And it gives everyone on this call great leverage to push because you have that full-throated commitment. So our signing of the MOU is kind of looking at things that are shared. Nuts that we both have to crack. Intermediaries is a big thing for both bilateral donors and for foundations. And I'd say local intermediaries, because often we've done offshore intermediaries, and the development of that sort of group of organizations, I think, is really important. We're also exploring whether there is a value chain from philanthropy to bilateral funding, whether our grantees can graduate, if you like. And the way I'm kind of looking at that right now is we're angel investors, AID and others are Series B, and we got to figure out where Series A is, what it's like, because the handshake isn't obvious yet. I'd also say we're trying to organize philanthropy on both sides of the Atlantic. As was said, 15 foundations, mostly US, have signed that donor statement. And I believe in May at the European Philanthropic Conference, there will be more on the European side. I urge foundations to get in touch with their own bilaterals and work together. And finally, I'd say, I think we all really need to work on a strong learning agenda, looking at you, ODI, because this work is based on a hypothesis. It's a robust hypothesis that getting resources close to where the problems are is going to improve impact, but we need to prove that as well. And it goes beyond just operational tweaks. But so if those on the call who are researchers can really put their heads together on helping us do that, I think it will be very good for the long-term robustness of the agenda. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Peter. Great call to action for the researchers among us, which we will definitely take to heart. I'll pass along to Moses now. So Moses, would love your thoughts in this conversation. You've written several pieces where you've argued that donors should take a vaccine approach, not a paracetamol approach to funding local actors. Keeping in mind it's not all about funding, but nevertheless, I'd be curious, what does a vaccine approach imply? When we think about it in medical terms, it's about prevention. It's not targeting symptoms, but causes, let's say, of disease. And what does this vaccine approach imply for the role and functions of a 21st century donor? So I'll pass it over to you now, Moses.
Thank you, Nirma. I think we all in agreement that the dominant system in development and humanitarianism really needs change. I mean, others have said structural fraud, others have been said is pathologically ill. And I think we all agree on one thing, that something must be done differently. I think for a long time, I think donors, whether it's bilateral donors or foundations, have kept civil society organizations on some form of starvation life cycle, giving them a little bit of money on that keeps them really, starvation life cycle. And so right now, the talk is really about localization or locally led development, which we think is sort of like a reaction to the shift to the power movement, which is coming from the global south, where we're saying we need to change the way we're doing business, whether it is donors, whether it's foundations. And so we're not quite sure whether really, when we talk about locally led development, whether there is the desire, the interest to change, or it is a result of fear of an existential threat that something must be done. I mean, we've heard severally that, donors, whether bilaterals or foundations, and even INGOs, that they perhaps would have to transform or die well or die badly. And so I think what we really think that, if we're going to be true to localization, or if we want to see what locally led development see the light of the day, that there are three simple things that we do. And of course, being post-COVID pandemic, I use the analogy of a vaccine. And I think if you're going to have 2 to 3 doses, the first dose is that there should be a conscious and deliberate effort for donors and foundations to provide direct funding. That is dose number 1. Dose number 2 is that, we need to be as much as possible also giving unrestricted funding. And the booster dose, perhaps, and the last dose there would be a multi-year funding, and not looking at a 1 or 2 years. So for me, when you look at these three, the direct funding, unrestricted funding, and multi-year funding is what I really call the vaccine approach, as opposed to the paracetamol approach, which is the usual business as usual, which keeps many of the organizations in the starvation life cycle. But that said, I think a couple of things that needs to be paid attention to. I mean, we all talk about localization and locally led development, but I think we need to also be able to talk what it is not, because oftentimes we talk about what it is, what we want to do, but what it is not. I think what it is not is that localization is not about cutting down transaction costs, because we see a number of foundations and donors trying to look at ways of cutting down transaction costs. If anyone does that, you are far away from localization or from local development. And also, localization is not about subcontracting. So I think if you know that it's not subcontracting, it's not cutting down transaction costs, then there are a couple of other things that we do which would actually also constitute the vaccine approach. One is that we need to take a conscious and deliberate departure from risk transfer to risk sharing. And what that means is that, whatever type, donors, foundations, they're going to have us to up their appetite for risk and look at the ways that risk can be shared, rather than where we see risk is being passed on from the back donor and, to those of us in the South. And then, of course, every time we're talking about localization, the central linchpin is money. And what I always say is that when it comes to development, I think it is important, donor, to take off the blinkers, that it's not only about money, because even as in the communities that we work with, they also have money, albeit very small volume. So communities have money, communities have got skills, the communities have got local knowledge and relationships. And I think that is important to pay attention to. So I think what we need to be talking is not only money, but how we can leverage these community assets. When we leverage these community assets, then we're able to trigger community voice, we're able to trigger community power, and we're able to provide agency, which is really, really what we need. So I think for me, really, finally, I think first of all, we even need to be moving away from just talking about locally led development. I think that's a little bit mechanistic. And I think inequality, core issues of these funding relations, which are really not partnerships, we need to be talking about decolonization. I think that is what will really be able to address the key issue. We need to be talking about how we can decolonize knowledge, how we can decolonize language and lexicon, because here we're really praying about the semantics of it, localization, is it locally led development? What is it exactly? And no wonder, Sarah started with the caveat that you don't like the term. So I think it is important that we address ourselves to the language and lexicon. And on the journey of actually doing development by donors or foundations is indeed in the hospice. And we must change to be able to ensure. I know that my time is spent. I'll keep it at that.
Thanks, Moses, and thanks for cutting out the camera, because I think you were in and out a little bit, so I think we heard the last bit much more clearly. I'm gonna just sort of move into Q&A, because there's a lot of questions here, and a lot of them kind of pick up on this point about vocabulary and terminology, the differences between localization and locally led development. And there's one question here which I think I'm gonna try and direct maybe to Peter, because Peter, you talked about the lyrical nature of the donor statement on supporting locally led development. And we have a question from Viveka Karlastam here, who has said that perhaps using the term locally led development is more practical now because of that statement and because of the ambition it shows. And in Swedish SIDA, that is the term that is being used. So I don't know if you have a comment on that, or linking back to Moses's point around the difference between localization and decolonization, and what we need to be talking about is decolonization. If you have any thoughts on that.
I think that we will never be satisfied with the vocabulary. So I think there will be grist for many webinars on this. I think that, I don't want to speak for the bilaterals, but I think it would be hard for them to march under a decolonization banner. But I think really look at the statement and what is said in it. Look at what the agencies have allowed themselves to be held accountable for. And admittedly, they are far from it, far from either the numerical targets or actually delivering on the qualitative promise. But when someone makes a declaration, you can hold them accountable for it. And I think with both carrot and stick, I support virtually everything that Moses said. And I think we need to work in an encouraging way with folks as well. Because this is the third time the idea has tried this. This is, in my estimation, there is much more opportunity to actually move this time than the previous two, and it's just our judgment. It's good to put our shoulder to helping that happen.
Thanks, Peter, for that. There's another question here, and I'm going to direct this to Orla, perhaps, on pooled funds, because Orla, I think you mentioned the multilateral engagement. So the question is, what is the accountability of the leads on localization in pooled funds? I hear a growing number of donors perceiving their contribution to pooled funds as a localization tool, but the percentage of budgets actually direct to national organizations is often very low in those pooled funds, even below 25%. I don't know if you had a comment on that.
No, look, it's one tool and it's not perfect. In terms of how we do locally led development at the moment, in an ideal world, we would do more direct funding, but just practically speaking, again, back to my point on being a small donor, it's quite challenging, to manage lots of different grants, etc. So, from our perspective, the pool funds are quite positive. But I have heard some issues with the quality of the funding that is passed on as well. So that's something that we advocate about quite actively as Ireland as well, when we can, in terms of our advocacy in the multilateral space, we do try and influence to ensure that there's quality funding being passed, etc. But it's a fair point. I think it's a fair point.
Great, thanks. And Julia, the question here about shifting incentives and decision making, so these recommendations are implemented. You talked about taxation rules, what is the incentive to shift that? Where has the movement been in Canada, and what might others learn globally from the Canadian experience, particularly on CRA rules?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the incentive was localization, the conversation around, and predates that in terms of the efficacy of aid and having, you know, equitable partnerships. So that conversation from the international assistance sector then filtered down to them coming together and saying, well, these CRA laws are totally antithetical to that because of this direction and control rule. So it was actually, you know, quite linked to the sector and the pushback, even though the charitable sector also exists in Canada. It's the same rules apply for both. So I think, yeah, having the sector, having forums and spaces to engage with what localization means from a mechanism standpoint in Canada, but also abroad, just to dig into the mechanisms that actually limit and impede. Tax laws are very obvious, right? But there's other things within government agencies in terms of their decision making around how they're going to measure success. That can also be pushed back if we have structured discussions around what does localization look like and what are the features that impede it. So I think it means that there must be a robust sector engagement on this topic. And that's why I was saying you need it coming from both sides, because if donors want this to happen, they also have to, you know, I don't know if pressure is the right word, but they have to provide guidance for the sector, because not everyone in the sector is doing this, right? And then similarly, the sector has to pressure the government, who is saying they want this, but isn't changing their stance. And I think that it's, you know, it's nation-based, but it's also a global movement to make these changes.
Great, thanks for that. Rosie, I'm going to direct one here on metrics. There's a question about how the struggle to develop metrics and clear definitions of success. And I'm wondering, you know, what your thoughts are on the whole kind of metric debate. I know you've been giving some thought to measurement issues recently.
Very good question, and not a very easy one to answer. I think metrics are often, you know, they are part of the DNA of how donors work, and it's understandable that people want the development of them and track progress on the commitments that they have made. But at the same time, I think they come with some risks, particularly, you know, part of what locally led development is or should be is a kind of bottom-up, context-led approach. And as soon as metrics or corporate donor-wide metrics are introduced, it suddenly becomes a compliance regime enforced from the top. And I think there's understandable resistance to that. And I think, you know, sometimes also metrics can precede the ability to actually achieve them, and therefore they can lead to quite a lot of frustration and perhaps a distraction from, I mean, perhaps having indicators around funding are obviously very important, but they don't, the 25% don't capture these issues around power and transferring power and decolonization. And if we become fixated with how much funding is reaching local actors, perhaps we are not paying enough attention to those, what I consider to be more challenging and more important aspects of localization, or if not decolonization and shifting power. So I think those would be my reflections on that question.
Thanks, Rosie. Moses, there's a question here kind of picking up on your desire to move the terminology towards decolonization from Majabin Kader, who asks, while localization is championed as a decolonization effort, how can it move beyond rhetoric to address those deeply entrenched power imbalances? In other words, isn't the decolonization move just so threatening to a donor? How do they practically engage without, you know, basically asking for their own demise, so to speak? Love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think oftentimes we think that the whole subject of decolonization is quite threatening. And so the quickest route to take is to talk about something which is mechanistic, it's an easy fix. You can, you know, sprinkle in a bit of tools and frameworks, but not really be able to address the root cause. Because, I mean, we know that some foundations are sunsetting. Others like Localisation in the UK has given over £35 million to communities. I think for me, those are foundations that are really putting their money where their mouth is. And if you're gonna do that, then you've got to go the full breadth. And I mean the people that work in the foundations and bilateral donors, to be brutally honest, they are rational individuals. Some of them have cut their teeth, and perhaps that's what they've all worked. And so it can be quite threatening. It can be looked as an existential threat. And so what we're actually seeing is there are a bit of resistance dots within donors and within bilateral donors. And yet there is a desire to speak to aspects of change. The appetite is really not to go the full length. So the appetite is to go towards something which is a bit simpler. So I think we need to go to the full length of decolonization and address the real root causes. And I think also important that I did mention is that we need to be addressing language and lexicon. I think development, as was coined by President Harry Truman in 1946, is a concept, you know. And then we talk all about these development jargons, language which is colonial, which is racist, which is pejorative. I think all that needs to be changed. So language and lexicon is an important ingredient of the conversation that we're talking about.
Thanks, Moses. One last question, maybe for Sarah. The comment about research, Sarah, and Peter's comment. There's also a question in the chat here. Intrigued by Peter's comments, and he agreeing that it's crucial for locally led approaches to lead to greater development impact and to show that. But if it's crucial, then isn't it important who defines the impact? Is it defined by the donors, by the researchers, I would add, by the communities in the local context? Don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I completely agree. And that's something, as you know, they've been trying to push internally as well in terms of how we develop our research priorities. Where do we start? Who defines them? It's not for us or for the donors. If you're really serious about research that can really shine a light on the challenges in a more direct way, it needs to be framed, set, led by colleagues that are closer to where these challenges are. And so we need to flip it on its head. But the problem is that there's a question that is really interesting in terms of how we adapt our approaches as research organizations, think tanks, I would say, and donor approaches to get closer to how our partners can respond and lead. Because we're always expecting them to fit with our frameworks and our priorities and the way in which we organize the research, the metrics by which we judge what is successful, what is impact, what is quality of research, rather than looking at what is fundamental. Is the whole these discussions about capacity, another term that I really have a lot of issues with, because we measure the capacity to write in English or sort of abide by some academic reference points that we have created, as the donors judge the capacity to fit into a log frame. But we never judge our capacity to work in a context in which we have no historical knowledge, no deep knowledge of the power dynamics, understand the nuances. And so it's reframing. Moses is absolutely right. This lexicon, this taxonomy, to become clearer about what we're trying to achieve and how, led by those who obviously will know better, because they are right at the heart of the issues that we're trying to address.
Great, thanks for that, Sarah. I'm sorry I don't have a chance to answer all the other questions, but I'll put someone could put my email in the chat, and I'll help you to try and direct those or answer them myself at a later date. I did want to quickly close with maybe a 20-second statement from each of you in terms of, what is the single most important thing that a donor needs to do to overcome, well, the most important barrier, and then the single most important thing they need to do to overcome it, I suppose. Why don't we start in reverse order? Moses, 20 seconds on your solution.
I think that the single most important thing is for any donor to understand and appreciate that the main purpose of aid is to stop aid.
Great,
so
very clear.
The reason we give aid is to stop aid. So
very clear.
I think with that at the back of your mind, every time a foundation, a donor is giving aid, he should be working himself or herself out of job. And so you want to do everything that aid should be able to stop aid.
Great. Peter?
Yeah, I agree with the comments that have been about donor humility, working with people. And this is fundamentally about right relationship and good donorship, in addition to really supporting what's going on at the grassroots.
Great. Humility. Thanks. Orla? Oh,
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself.
yes.
I just wanted to echo what Moses said. I think it's knowing what our end goal is and being clear about that, because I feel like sometimes we're having these conversations a lot and we're talking about different, what we mean by success. We're different in that. So I think coming to some consensus on that would be great. Thanks.
Great. Thanks. Julia?
I'm going to have to echo what Moses said in terms of that. You know, we're trying to work ourselves out of a job. So what are the paths? An actual plan? I'm speaking of Canadian government, but a plan to get there with timelines and also, you know, intersecting features of what that looks like beyond aid as well.
Great. And lastly, Rosie?
Yeah, for me, I mean, out of the 5 barriers that we identified, undoubtedly the most important one is the power asymmetry, the power imbalance. And I think this is about, perhaps this response to how the end game of localization is really about shifting power and putting local decision making and local leadership at the heart of localization, what it is and what it wants to achieve.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you for this conversation. I know it could have been longer. Please, if you had a question and we weren't able to address it and you really, it's a burning one, send me an email and I will try and cobble together an answer. Please do keep in touch. We've put the link to the newsletter and several pieces of research and statements and rules and regulations. I can see CRA rules are up there. That'll make a good bedtime read. And thank you again to our audience and our panelists, especially for joining us. Wish you a good end of day and let's keep in touch.